Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the Conversation Africa's virtual dialogue, How to Stop the Proxy War and Restore Sovereignty in Sudan. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Candice Bailey, and it's really great for you to join us today for what promises to be a critical and timely discussion. This event is part of the Conversation Africa's 2025 virtual dialogue series, convening scholars, policymakers, and practitioners to explore African-led solutions to urgent continental challenges. A quick reminder before we begin is that this session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube playlist in the next few days. So if you know somebody that's not able to join us today, please feel free to share the link with them in the next few days. The Q&A box is available for your questions. Please type your questions into this box and we will keep it for the Q&A part of the panel. And if you are sharing your reflections on social media, please use the hashtag TCA Dialogues and hashtag Sudan Peace. Now, colleagues, a big part of what we do at the Conversation Africa is work with academics as experts to ensure that their work gets put out into the public domain. So in true conversation form, we're going to be sharing the stage with our experts today, and the discussion is going to be moderated by Dr. Jan Pospisil. Now, it's my pleasure to hand over to you, Dr. Pospisil, as the moderator. Now, Dr. Pospisil is an associate professor at the Center for Peace and Security at Coventry University. His work focuses on peace and transition processes and political settlements, peace mediation, donor politics in peace building, competitive regionalism, resilience, the Horn of Africa region, and South Sudan and Sudanese politics. Dr. Pospisil has extensive field research experience in sub-Saharan Africa with a focus on South Sudan. And since 2019, he has been part of the team conducting the South Sudan Public Perceptions of Peace Survey, a project that is continuing in collaboration with DETRO Research and Advisory. Dr. Jan, over to you, and I hope that you enjoy the panel with your discussion. Dr. Jan?
Thanks so much. Trying to get my video started.
Perfect. Let me give you a few seconds.
Yeah.
In the meanwhile, may I invite the panelists to also turn on their videos?
The problem is, I'm disabled. So if you enable my video, then
let me try.
Now it works. Very good.
There we go.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much indeed to what is a timely discussion, promises a very important discussion today. Given that the Sudan war is now going on for more than 2.5 years, and the human cost and the tragedy behind this war is hardly comparable with anything else that is going on the planet at the moment. It doesn't make much sense, I guess, to come up with numbers. We don't know so much what is happening on the ground anyway. There will be deaths in the hundreds of thousands probably. There have been millions displaced outside the country and as IDPs inside the country. And what adds to the regional problem that most of the people displaced by the war in Sudan are in countries that are in severe issues of their own, like a lot of them in South Sudan, for instance, which has big internal issues at the same time with donor cuts that hit the country hard. In Chad, where the situation is as problematic, and in other neighboring countries as well. Egypt is probably one of the countries where there are the most refugees at the moment. At the same time, we see a new constellation when it comes to involvement in the war, but also in trying to make peace in these circumstances. We find expectations loaded upon regional institutions like the African Union or IGAD, which they struggle to fulfill. We find new extra constellations like the so-called Quad. At the moment, a very loose alliance maintained by the United States with the UAE, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia as part of it, in an attempt to bring at least at one table all those international actors that are actively involved in the war. we'll see how these things go out, and I think this sets a bit the scene of how our and what our discussion is dealing with today. I'm joined by a distinguished panel. I may run through our participants to give you an idea who is here. We have Professor John Mukumbaku. He's professor of economics and law at the Weber State University in the United States. More precisely, a Presidential Distinguished Professor of Economics, and John S. Hinckley Fellow. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and an attorney and consular at law licensed to practice in the Supreme Court of the state of Utah, the U.S. District Court for the District of Utah, and the U.S. Supreme Court. His research interests are in public choice, constitutional political economy, sustainable development, law and development, international human rights, intellectual property, rights of indigenous groups, women and children, trade integration, and particularly timely here, institutional reforms in Africa. Professor John, welcome to this discussion. And we have Dr. May Darwish. She's actually located not far from where I sit in London. She's Associate Professor of International Relations of the Middle East at the University of Birmingham, and author of the book like Threats and Alliances in the Middle East, Saudi and Syrian Policies in a Turbulent Region, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2019. Welcome, Dr. May. And then we have Dr. Chathat Birgon, is the African Regional Advocacy Coordinator at Amnesty International. He leads Amnesty's international advocacy initiatives and engagements with the African Union and diplomatic representatives accredited with to the African Union. He's also an adjunct lecturer at the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. Dr. Birgon has more than 15 years professional experience in the field of governance, human rights, social justice, international criminal justice, peace and security, and transitional justice. He holds a Doctor of Laws degree and LLD in international human rights law from the University of Pretoria. With that, perhaps let's start the first round among the panelists to discuss and unpack a bit what lies at the heart of the Sudanese crisis. What's the domestic rivalries? What are the foreign interventions and the parameters of this foreign involvement in the crisis? Perhaps I'll start with you, Professor John, and I may ask you from a governance and economic perspective, what would you see as the structural weaknesses that made Sudan so vulnerable to external manipulation and external influence?
Thank you, Dr. Yan, and thank you everybody for inviting me to participate in this very important program. One of the problems that we see here with respect to Sudan is that Sudan is strategically located as the gateway to the Red Sea. And it has a coastline that connects to the Suez Canal. So it's a very important position, means that a lot of external actors are very interested in Sudan, primarily because of its location. That's one of the issues that has made Sudan so attractive to intervention by foreign groups. For example, Russia and Iran are reported to be interested in establishing a naval base in Sudan. And so they have been involved in governance in Sudan, primarily because they are interested in gaining favor with whoever is ruling Sudan. And so as a result of that, they are supporting one of the parties involved in this conflict. The second thing is that Sudan has significant levels of mineral wealth, gold, for example. And as a result, countries like Russia, the United Arab Emirates, they've been engaged in resource extraction. And given the fact that Sudan is not in a position in which you can easily determine who is in charge of natural resources, these countries have been supporting one of the parties involved in the conflict in order to have an opportunity to be able to have access to those minerals. So the third issue has to do with the fact that there's significant level of political instability and weak governance structures in Sudan, dating back to the time when they gained independence. Sudan has not been able to come up, or rather, the Sudanese people have not been able to come up with institutional structures that can provide for peaceful coexistence, for peaceful transfer of power. And so the military has been involved in governance in Sudan on and off for many years. And as a result of that, the country has failed to develop appropriate structures for regime transfer, appropriate structures for individuals to engage in governance at all levels, regional, local, and so on. Then the 2019 revolution ousted Omar Bashir, who had been in power for a very long period of time, and created a transitional government that was supposed to lead Sudan to a democratic system. Unfortunately, competing agendas within the transitional government, and as well as a lack of security and cohesion, provided a stage for what we now have today as the conflict between the central government and the rapid support forces, which were actually created by the government in Khartoum to help them fight insurgencies in Darfur. And so these militias have become a threat to the government. Then you have the international community's response, which over the years has been uncoordinated, contradictory, and ineffective. And part of the reason has to do with the fact that many of the external forces or the international community that was intervening in Sudan was not doing so in a coordinated effort to help the Sudanese people develop appropriate institutions for economic and political development. Many of these groups were going into Sudan with the expectation of maximizing their own interests, as opposed to helping Sudan develop a system that will allow the Sudanese people to develop, to maximize their own interests in terms of peaceful coexistence and economic development, entrepreneurship, and wealth creation. Finally, you have deep ethnic and regional divisions. Every country in Africa has deep ethnic and regional divisions. The problem you have in Sudan is that these divisions were exploited by external sources, external actors, and to allow them to maximize their own interests, and in the process made it virtually impossible for the Sudanese people to develop. And you can see very clearly some of the outcomes of the divisions. The emergence of South Sudan as an independent country comes directly from these deep divisions, which for many years forced people in the southern provinces of Sudan to feel that they were not part of Sudan because of the way Khartoum treated them. And so eventually they were able to leave. But other divisions exist, like Darfur, for example, which continues to struggle with the government in Khartoum. And as a result, this has led to the type of structure in Sudan that has created problems for governance, problems for economic development, problems for entrepreneurship, problems for wealth creation, even problems for internal migration, which is very important for economic development, for labor to move from one part of Sudan to another where their skills are needed the most. That has become virtually impossible. And as a result, we have this problem that we have today, which is the inability of Khartoum to rule the country. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Allow me perhaps one follow-up question. You mentioned the problem of institutionalization that was basically the rule of the day of within the Bashir regime. So the even I would call it deinstitutionalization that the NCP rule had at this disposal. So what if there is a transitional order that would in a way restructure the Sudanese state after this war, what would be the main legal and institutional steps here? And how to restore, as we have it in the title, sovereignty in Sudan, and here especially the question, the sovereignty of whom?
Well, I think one of the most important things that the Sudanese need to do, which I believe they have not been able to do since independence, is to first recognize that Sudan belongs to all the groups that live within the country, regardless of their ethnic or religious background. The second issue, the second thing that has to be taken into consideration is that the Sudanese people must be allowed to rule themselves, and that leaders within Sudan should not seek alliances outside Sudan in order to maintain power. If they want to stay in power, they should seek alliances within Sudan. In other words, they should get the power to rule from the Sudanese people, and they should try to get the Sudanese people together so that they can sit down and develop a constitution that is based on Sudanese ideals, Sudanese interests, Sudanese history, so that the constitution reflects the difficulties, the problems that they have within the country. One of the things that I've often marveled at people in Africa is that African countries like Sudan come up with a governance system, but the governance system doesn't take into consideration the fact that in order for a country to develop, you have to allow for free internal migration, meaning that people should be able to leave one part of the country to another and be allowed to participate in governance and in the economy as citizens of that country, regardless of what part of Sudan they are in. So one of the things that the Sudanese need to do to establish a legal framework that will allow them to govern themselves and politically and economically is that legal framework should come from within the Sudanese people. There has to be a process through which the Sudanese people sit down, recognize their differences, recognize the difficulties that they face, recognize the historical problem that have existed in the country for so many years, and then come together and structure a legal framework that would allow them to deal with those problems, and realize that Sudan cannot solve its problems by looking outward. No external actors are going to solve the problems for Sudan. It is true that the Sudanese people need foreign aid to be able to solve the problems that have been created by war. But they have to also understand that foreign aid always comes with conditionalities that may make it impossible or difficult for them to develop. And so the thing that needs to be taken into consideration and understood is the issue of the Sudanese people developing a legal framework that belongs to them, that is developed by them, that reflects their own individual situation, that reflects the history of the country, the complexities of the country, that allows them to be able to develop themselves, and which is acceptable to all of them, so that they can use it to frame peaceful coexistence, which is necessary for the type of wealth creation, entrepreneurship, and wealth creation that they need.
Thanks so much for this first instance, Professor John. Dr. May, may I turn to you and basically follow up on what Professor John just said about the impact of regional powers on Sudanese politics and the Sudanese conflict. Perhaps can you give us an overview of how you see how especially powers in the wider Horn region, especially Egypt, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, have shaped the trajectory of Sudanese politics and the Sudanese war in particular over recent years?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. I think to be able to understand the involvement of these regional actors, it didn't really start with the outbreak of the war, but it has roots even from like the very early stages of the Sudanese state formation. And I'm not going to talk about the whole history, but I just would like to highlight a few things. When we look, for example, at the role of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, for example, the relationship between the regime in Sudan before 2019 and the regime of Omar al-Bashir was falling. Somehow the relationship with the militias, but also with the armed forces, have been very much strengthened because of the Sudanese support to the Saudi and the UAE wars in Yemen. And there was lots of mercenaries from Sudan, sometimes estimated up to 40,000 from Sudan, that were fighting in Yemen on behalf of the Saudi and the Emirati armies. So in a way, this relationship kind of like stretched for years before. And since the fall of the regime of Omar al-Bashir, all of these actors kind of found a stake in the new regime. And they were more or less interfering in order to shape the transition. So the result would be in their favor and in the favor of their interests in Sudan. Egypt was definitely involved in the transition period and, of course, had a very strong support for the Sudanese armed forces from the very beginning, but also was very much in support of replacing of the regime that was falling in 2019 with another military regime that would be very much in alignment with the Egyptian kind of priorities in the region. So in a way, all of these actors before the outbreak of the war, they were very much involved in the transition. They were very much having a stake in how the transition would turn out. And of course, before the outbreak of the war, the support, or let's say the division and the support, wasn't very clear, but all of them, they were involved one way or another. And apart from the military and let's say the political interest in the transition, all of these countries had also economic interests in Sudan. So the UAE and Saudi Arabia in the last decade have made huge investment in the agriculture sector. There is also an eye towards infrastructural development and infrastructural investment that many of the Gulf countries were looking at Sudan with an eye of developing opportunities. So in a way, there was a lot of interest as well in maintaining these kind of investments and kind of fostering some sort of control and influence on Sudanese politics. Once the war broke out, all of these countries started kind of taking sides, and it became very clear that Egypt and Saudi Arabia were very much in support of the Sudanese armed forces, and the UAE, which has risen as the most powerful intervention power in the conflict, has more or less taken the side of the RSF. And now we have a problem because all of these countries are not just interested in Sudan. Their divides over the Yemen politics, their divides over other issues in the Middle East were kind of battled in Sudan. And of course, this is not a simple kind of balance of power, but it was also an issue of how the Middle East in general affected the positions of these countries in Sudan when it came to that particular war. So the issue became even more complex because the war seemed like it's going to last for a very long time. Countries started investing in supporting in terms of military, in terms of economy, but more importantly, they were also very much interested that the outcome of the war would be very much in favor of their choice. So there is no incentive until now to actually find peace or stability in Yemen. But more importantly, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, their support to the Sudanese armed forces stems from, let's say, a cultural perspective that they don't trust militias. They would trust a military institution. So their position of supporting the Sudanese armed forces stems from their own preferences. It doesn't mean that the Sudanese armed forces is a better or a much more conservative actor. It simply aligns with their strategic culture in the region. The UAE has other interest in supporting the RSF in terms of trade, trafficking of gold, but also supporting many of their goals of upsetting the balance of power that already existed in Sudan and more or less fostering its power as a regional power through the Sudan conflict. Again, we will find here that all of these goals and all of these kind of agendas are not necessarily about Sudan itself, but it's more about the Saudi UAE competition that unfolded slightly in Yemen, but also in the Gulf. It's also about the UAE effort of expanding its economic power in Egypt, in Libya, in Sudan, in East Africa. And also, it's about Saudi Arabia trying to find its position in the region and establish itself as a regional power. And in the middle of this, Egypt, which has the high stake in the war, is also trying to protect its borders and also trying to maintain a friendly regime in Sudan that it could deal with, and also maintain its control over the issue of the Nile, which has more or less been a very pressing issue in Egyptian politics, and Sudan has been more or less the only allied country that stood aside Egypt. So each country has some of these issues, but what made things even more complicated that we have other actors which are involved with even more different agendas, like Iran, for example, which again has been a long-standing ally of the regime of Omar al-Bashir. I mean, it only like the relationship started being strained a little bit after the Abraham Accords, where the Sudan shifted its alliance. But since the 1980s, Iran provided military and economic aid to Sudan. And of course, with the outbreak of the war, Iran saw another opportunity to actually come back to Sudanese politics in different forms. Until now, it's not very clear to what extent they are actually involved, but there is evidence that they've provided the Sudanese Armed Forces with drones, with ammunition, and with intelligence. On top of this, we have Russia as well. And also, it's very important to see the history that Russia has been more or less responsible since 2003 for around 80% of the arms sale to Sudan. So again, all of these countries have been more or less involved militarily and economically in Sudan before the outbreak of the war. Russia has been a strong supporter of the Sudanese Armed Forces, but at the same time, we have the Wagner Group, which is a group of mercenaries, have been very much allied with the RSF. So we have here as well different like non-state actor and a state actor from Russia involved in this kind of regional and international dynamic. I'm going to stop here, but I'm going to be happy to answer more questions later.
Yeah, I have one particular follow-up, and let me combine two elements here. You mentioned the UAE's particular interest to kind of unsettle the balance of power. Now, I wonder, given that UAE has substantial investments in Egypt as well, but also they had been basically offered by the Sudanese Armed Forces a sweet deal that they could probably get most of the economic interests out of them as well. Why would they still maintain this clear stance with RSF? And then against the background, let me also turn to the question of diplomatic and basically peacemaking strategies in this setting, especially the attempt now of the US of getting all these actors, basically the main three you were talking about, with the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, on board in one kind of vehicle, the Quad. We had several attempts like this before, but this was also before Trump was president, and we have seen now in other areas that there might be a different way of leveraging power that we had seen before. So I would be very interested in your takes on this.
Yes, thank you very much for the UAE. Thank you very much for that question. The UAE is a very puzzling actor, but nevertheless, its position in Sudan is very much consistent with its overall regional politics. So on the one hand, they are investing in Egypt, they have a lot of stake, but that doesn't mean that it's 100% agreement with the government on Egypt on all issues. They disagree on Sudan, they disagree on the Gaza war, they disagree on Yemen. And this has been more or less the case since since the Arab uprisings. There's nothing that is not consistent. So even though they would invest, but they also have a plan, or not really a plan, but they have a tendency to challenge even their allies. So they would challenge Egypt. They would invest money in Egypt, but at the same time, they would like to challenge the authority. They would like to challenge the state. And in many of the conflicts where they have been involved, like Yemen or Libya and now Sudan, they have been always standing against the mainstream of other Arab countries. So Saudi Arabia, for example, was supporting the legitimate government. The UAE would support like the southern Yemeni forces that would basically, they were aiming for secession. The same thing in Libya. They don't really align with the main Arab government or the Turkish government position in Libya, but rather they would support the secessionist movement. Also in Sudan, they wouldn't ally with the government, but they would support a militia or, let's say, a force that aims to disrupt and unrest the existing status quo. So in a way, their position somewhat aligns with their overall foreign policy tendencies in the region and in these kind of similar situations. Why they're doing this? I think this is just a strategy to assert power, but in a different way. They know that they're not such a big country. It's not a big state. It's not even a middle power. They have a lot of resources and they try to exert power by disrupting the existing status quo. For the peacemaking question and the attempts by the different actors, I am quite pessimistic about this. And I don't think the finding a settlement for this conflict would be easy, unfortunately. And I don't want to take too much because I know there will be a second round, but I think one of the most important issues here is to look at the successful settlements, previous settlements in history. And they often require a very strong mediator and a third party who is very much willing to send troops on the ground to hold both parties accountable in order to exert the agreed settlement. And I think in order to assess the situation, we would have to ask ourselves, is the US going to take that risk of sending troops, either US troops or UN troops, to do this? Whether the African Union is going to do this, whether other negotiators like Saudi Arabia or Turkey or other actors who have shown an interest in negotiating, whether they would be willing to take that risk or not. And I don't think they're willing, and I don't think there's a strong incentive for them in this situation to do so. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Dr. Chaput, may I turn to you now and ask you, Agard, about the human rights violations that are ongoing in the current war. What are you documenting here? How would you see the responsibilities set? So who is responsible for what, and how does the situation look like at the moment?
Thank you, Han, for having me. Yes, indeed. As an organization, Amnesty International has been documenting numerous human rights violations and violations of humanitarian law since the start of the conflict in April 2023. We've published several reports touching on different aspects of violations and abuses. And sadly, the reports that we have published show the devastating impact and toll that the conflict has had on civilians. Let me just focus on some 4 particular trends. One is the indiscriminate attacks. We have documented that both parties to the conflict, SAF and RSF and their allied militias, have often used explosive weapons with wide area effects. The result is that they have also used these weapons in and around densely populated neighborhoods. The result is that many people, tens of thousands, have been killed since the conflict started, many of them inside their homes, and some of them desperately searching for food and other necessities. The fact that people have been found and have been killed in their homes really is reflected in one of our first reports that we published in August of 2023 titled "Death Came to Our Home." When people thought that when retreating back to their homes, they will be safe, weapons and attacks found them there. Other peoples have been killed while they were fleeing from their homes and in places where they had sought safety, in hospitals, in schools, and other places. The second trend of violations that we have seen are targeted attacks by both parties to the conflict, and particularly the RSF. And here we have seen a particular trend, not just in Khartoum, in Gezira, but particularly in West Darfur, where RSF and its allied militias have particularly carried out ethnically motivated attacks against the Masalid and other non-Arab communities. The third trend that we've also documented since the start of the conflict is sexual violence. Women and girls have been subjected to conflict-related sexual violence, including rape, gang rape, and sexual slavery by members of both sides of the conflict, but particularly widespread by RSF. Our report that we published in April of this year shows, for instance, that the RSF has carried out widespread sexual violence on women and girls throughout the conflict, mainly to humiliate, to assert control, and displace communities across the country. The violations that we have documented in this report of April 2025 relating to conflict-related sexual violence not only show that these violations amount to war crimes, but also may possibly amount to crimes against humanity. Lastly, one aspect that I wanted also to mention, Jan, is really the impact of this conflict on socioeconomic rights, the right to food, the right to health, and the right to education. A whole generation of children have not been able to go to school because of the conflict. At this moment in time, one of the scenarios or the situations that really brings out the impact of the conflict on civilians is the siege in El Fasher. Since May 2024, El Fasher has been besieged. And the result is that food insecurity has reached dire levels. You'll remember that a famine was declared in El Fasher towards the end of last year. Aid is no longer able to reach El Fasher. And Amnesty International, as an organization, we are really concerned that in the coming weeks and months, the situation may get critical. And therefore, there is really need for opening up of El Fasher or a humanitarian corridor for individuals affected in this area to be to find safely out. Those, I think, are the four main areas that I wanted to mention just to begin with: the indiscriminate attacks by both parties, targeted attacks based on ethnically motivated attacks, sexual violence, and the impact of the siege on El Fasher and other parts of the country. Thank you, Jan, for the opportunity.
Thanks so much. Let me ask you perhaps one more question, and this goes into the issue of accountability for these crimes that are happening. I mean, they are obviously man-made. Now, when we look into the accountability structures, there's indeed a few things happening. There had been sanctioning by the US, for instance, of some of the leaders of the two armed belligerent factions. We had seen with the ICC becoming active. There had been a ruling now on Sudan, but this was going back 20 years. But we have also ICC investigations ongoing. But it is a bit uneven because at the same time, the UN is a bit hesitant, others as well. There had been issues at the African Union, that they're kind of that the Sudan at the moment is not a member, but like not active because of this. What would you see as the best accountability mechanisms forward, but also taking into account that there might be people there that, whether we like it or not, we have to speak to at one point when a peace mediation moves forward?
Thank you, Jan, for that crucial question. I think to begin with, you've spoken about sanctions, and here I think the issue of arms embargo comes into play. As you know, there's been an arms embargo in Darfur since the early 2000s. One of the things that need to happen as part of a broader accountability mechanism is to ensure that the arms embargo that only applies to Darfur is actually now extended to other parts of the country, to the whole country, because what we have seen is that actors bring arms into other parts of Sudan and then transfer it to Darfur. We have documented transfer of newly manufactured weapons from different countries, including UAE, Turkey, Russia, and China, for instance. So the expansion of that arms embargo to the whole of the country, and then strict enforcement and monitoring mechanism. Secondly, as you mentioned, the ICC, as you know, the referral of the UN Security Council to the of the situation in Sudan to the ICC is only limited to the Darfur region. So there is a need again to expand that to other parts of the country, because serious violations have happened, as I've just mentioned, in other parts of the country other than Darfur. But in terms of justice and accountability, we know that currently there are two mechanisms that are trying to document human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law for purposes of prosecution and holding individuals accountable down the road. And this is the Human Rights Council mandated international fact-finding mission on Sudan, and then the joint fact-finding mission on Sudan by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. What needs to be done, I'm glad that the Human Rights Council, and we're glad that the Human Rights Council recently renewed the mandate of its fact-finding mission. But what needs to be done is, one, these mechanisms to be resourced so that they are able to actually conduct the documentation, preserve evidence that will be used later for justice and accountability. Secondly, is relevant actors in the international community need to put pressure on Sudan and the neighboring countries to allow access to these fact-finding missions. Because so far, these fact-finding missions have not been able to access Sudan, and in many instances also, they have not been able to access neighboring countries where they could actually collect crucial evidence, speak to witnesses, speak to victims, and be able to document the extent and scale of the conflict. So I think those are the starting points in terms of moving forward in terms of justice and accountability. Over to you back, Jan.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Dr. Chaffet, for that. Let us perhaps then go to a second round and think a bit more about the opportunities now of peacemaking. May I before also encourage the audience, people in attendance, to send us some questions that might arise in our discussion. Professor John, coming back to you, perhaps we can discuss a bit more about potential transitional arrangements then. So should there be an agreement, and we have heard how difficult this might be and how unlikely, but there would be also the question then, given all the costs of war and the need for reconstruction, how could and transitional arrangements look like also in ensuring international trust, so there would be investment in and the necessary external support in Sudan's rebuilding?
Okay. The issue here is for us to come to the realization that the future of Sudan lies in the hands of the Sudanese people. And this is something that the Sudanese people themselves need to understand very clearly. And when we say Sudanese people, it is important for us who are talking about Sudan to understand that there are many types of people in Sudan. Sudan is a heterogeneous society, just like other African countries. And so it is very important that the Sudanese people agree and recognize their differences, their heterogeneous nature, and note that the only way they can move forward politically and economically is for them to accept those differences and find a way to live together peacefully with each other so that they can then devote their efforts to development. Sudan has a lot of natural resources, and those natural resources can be canvassed to develop the country. But in order to do so, you need peace. And that peace has to be peace that is secured in a way that someone investing in the country knows that that investment would be long-term as opposed to short-term investment. And that idea is very difficult for many countries in Africa to understand, but it is the only way to move forward, because if you don't have sustained peace, and peace that people understand and accept and recognize, you're not going to be able to develop. So we have to give Sudan, or rather we have to tell ourselves that there has to be in Sudan the construction of institutional structures that will secure the peace, not only temporarily, but on a long-term basis, and allow the Sudanese people to recognize those institutions, have a stake in them, believe in them, and know that if they are going to, if, for example, if you are a college student in Sudan and you're going to devote 5 or 6 years to studying, you know that when you graduate, you will be able to get a job or start a business, and that business will be long-term. Otherwise, why would you want to devote significant resources to a long process of education? Or if you're an external investor, why would you want to go into Sudan instead of going to another area when you are not sure that once you devote your investment, you'll be able to reap the benefits of the investment in a long period. Now, the reconstruction of Sudan would require a lot of resources. Foreign aid is going to play a very important part. And as I said earlier, the country has been devastated. If you go to Khartoum now, you wouldn't recognize Khartoum, primarily because the place has been destroyed significantly. And so there's going to be a need for reconstruction. And that reconstruction will require a lot of foreign aid. But unfortunately, foreign aid comes with conditionality. So if we are appealing to the international community to help Sudan reconstruct, that appeal has to consider the fact that these countries, the US, for example, would invariably want to put conditionalities on Sudan. For example, when the president of the US was in power the first time, he was engaged in the Abraham Accords. Now, the question that always comes to my mind is, if the US is going to help Sudan reconstruct its infrastructure, roads, water treatment plants, electricity, and things like that, will that aid for reconstruction be tied to Sudan supporting US interest in the Middle East and including Israel? Will that be the situation? And I think that would be an unfortunate situation, primarily because it would then put Sudan in a situation in which they will not be able to engage in the types of regional partnerships that will allow them to develop, because the partners may not be interested in Sudan becoming part of an arrangement that allows the US to support Israel, and so on and so on. So the question then becomes, what kind of aid will the international community provide Sudan for its reconstruction? That aid should be aid that does not tie the hands of the Sudanese people. It should be aid that is designed specifically to provide an opportunity for Sudan to redevelop the country, to provide the type of governance structure that will allow Sudan to maximize the interest of the Sudanese people, all the Sudanese people, and develop an economy that will allow the Sudanese people to extract their own resources for their own benefit, and develop an economy that will allow Sudan to become a partner with countries in the region. For example, Ethiopia and the new dam. Sudan may want to cooperate with Ethiopia and the new dam in order to control floods and provide for an opportunity to purchase electricity from the new dam to develop the country. Any foreign aid should not interfere with that process. Sudan may want to cooperate with neighboring countries in West Africa in order to deal with the refugee problem. The aid that is being given, regardless of who is giving the aid to Sudan, should not interfere with the ability of Sudan to make use of regional cooperation within the Horn of Africa to develop its country. So I think that the key for Sudan now is for the international community to aid the country so that it can develop a governance structure that will allow them to be able to govern themselves by themselves, to develop their own economy by themselves, and use their location within the Horn of Africa, within North Africa, to develop the kinds of relationships that will allow them to continue to develop themselves, to trade with other countries like Ethiopia, like Egypt, to solve regional problems like the problems that they're having in the Nile Basin without interference from the other countries. As an earlier speaker had said, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, these are countries that can be very useful to Sudan in terms of moving the country forward. But the issue here is that if they are going to do so, they should not tie the hands of the Sudanese people by imposing conditionalities on them that are designed to benefit these external actors, but not Sudan. Because if they do so, this conflict would only continue to exacerbate and put the Sudanese people in a position in which they will continue to suffer. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Professor John. Dr. May I continue with you and ask a bit that we had now again some discussion about the regional setting around. Let me explore a bit with you how African-led mediation could look like to the conflict. We have the African Union, and I think everybody would kind of agree in theory in a leading role, but in practice, we haven't seen so much of that. We have seen quite a lot of attempts of meetings. We have seen a lot of constant meetings. There had been issues between some of the competing countries, like in Egypt, especially, and others, around the African Union efforts to get something going. How would you see an African-led mediation on Sudan going off the ground?
Yes, thank you, Jan, very much for the question. I think one of the things that it's important to bear in mind that most of the attempts for mediation or negotiations have failed for various reasons. The first reason that the warring parties, have no incentive and no interest in stopping the war. And that's mainly because each of them, they see it as a zero-sum game, that they would like to end the war in their own terms with a clear victory. So as long as there is no clear victory for each side, they don't really have an incentive to negotiate. especially that the arms, the ammunition, and the international support is continuing. Also, the leaders, even though that this war started as a divide between generals over power and wealth and control, it's not about them anymore. I mean, they have a constituency, they have people fighting behind, and it's not up to them. So there needs to be some mediation that takes into account the complexity and the layers of this. So an African-led mediation could overcome some of the problems by building some trust between these two parties. Most of the mediators that have been involved, either the US or the EU or even other countries, have been more or less biased. And this sort of bias sort of triggers some sort of discomfort, lack of trust between the parties, and of course the negotiations just fall. So the first kind of step for a successful mediation is really to find a mediator who's capable of engaging the two parties without necessarily being biased, in order to build like a minimum level of trust. Also, direct negotiation between the two parties have failed. And I think for a successful mediation, there needs to be a new approach of engaging both in a non-direct mediation. And I think the African Union has some of the tools to execute this, but the problem and the challenge remains that they need to enforce the agreement if they reach an agreement. And that is the problem. Most of the civil wars that ended in some sort of an agreement, there is always a transition period where the third party is involved and kind of provides some sort of safe passage for both parties on the ground, and they have to do this on the ground. And in a way, unless there are any institutions or any countries who have an interest and are willing to take that risk, I don't see this happening in the current balance of power. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Perhaps just to follow up on this, I mean, there have been quite a few African mediators in several types of roles. We have Lamamra, who is the United Nations Special Envoy from Algeria. We had the panel around Chambas at the African Union, which is, I think, technically still in place. It might be dissolved or not, we don't know. But there were people from, I mean, there was Francisco Madeira from Mozambique. There was the colleague from Uganda. So there was a variety of countries, African countries, actively involved that you would not necessarily, I mean, Algeria is a bit of a different question, but not necessarily seen always as biased. So how would you see these attempts in relation to what you just said?
I think most of these attempts are great, and I think we should continue supporting these attempts. The main problem that there is no incentive. There is no concrete incentive for the warring party to come to the table, and I think this is the problem. The main problem is that with the continued networks of trade that sustains both parties alive, capable of fighting, capable of getting the ammunition, capable of maintaining that international support from both sides, they don't really have a clear incentive in stopping the war. And the only way I see it for a successful mediation to start, before it starts, there needs to be some pressure put on both parties. And this could be by banning some types of trade, by controlling the unregulated trade around gold, around trafficking, arms sale. But unless this happens, I don't really see, the problem is not the mediation itself, it's really the conditions around the mediation that makes it successful or not. So even though these attempts were great, some actors are not biased, but in the end, they are not willing to put boots on the ground. They don't have the resources, but also they don't have the power to pressure both parties to come to the table. And I think this is the problem.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks so much for that. Dr. Shafat, may I come to you and ask a bit and explore a bit what would be in a way, civil society responses to this, especially around like the broader kind of regional civil society? How could they be empowered to say more? And let me combine this also with one question that came from the audience about the neglect. Specifically, the colleague asked why there's so much international neglect, especially from the media, regarding what's happening in Sudan. And I think this might be one of the issues why there is so little leverage. Perhaps you can expand a bit on that.
Thank you, Jan, for that question. I think civil society have a great role to play, especially in amplifying and bringing visibility to the conflict. Unfortunately, as one of the participants has said, the conflict is increasingly becoming yet another forgotten conflict on the continent. And Sudanese people feel forgotten, feel neglected, feel ignored by the international community in general, because despite the efforts that have been put in place by the international community, they still remain awfully inadequate. No wonder that 2.5 years later, we are still speaking about this conflict, which continues to have a devastating impact on civilians, as I initially said. What then can civil society do? So already civil society have been trying, to bring visibility, to document human rights violations and abuses that have been happening. But one thing that I think that needs to be done also across the continent is for civil society, across the citizens, the Africans of civil society, to consider this as an African conflict. Imagine a situation where civil society in different parts of the continent would put fire under the feet of their own countries and inquire accountability from them and ask them, what are you doing about the conflict in Sudan, for instance? As a member of the African Union, what are you doing about this conflict? So not that just the organizations working, civil society working on the Sudan conflict, but civil society across the continent. For instance, there has been on the table for several months now the proposal of an extraordinary summit of the African Union on the Sudan conflict. That has not happened. If civil society from Sierra Leone, from Kenya, from across the country would really demand from their governments to move beyond rhetoric, and then do an action. For instance, this simple action of an extraordinary summit. So civil society across the continent really demanding action from their own governments. Another important aspect of civil society, and we have seen this working in other areas, is really strengthening and invoking universal jurisdiction, so that perpetrators of this conflict will not have safe havens on the continent or elsewhere beyond the continent. So civil society actually demanding justice and accountability. You'll recall, Jan, the visits by al-Bashir when he was president to Kenya, to South Africa, and other parts of the continent. It was civil society that said that he's been indicted, he's wanted by the ICC, and he needs to be held accountable, arrested and surrendered to the ICC. So again, civil society need to put demands on their governments on universal jurisdiction, on their commitments under relevant treaties, including the Rome Statute on international criminal law, to ensure that perpetrators don't have a safe haven within the continent and also beyond the continent. I would say that as some of the two things that I think civil society can play a critical role beyond, of course, documenting and continuing to disseminate violations and abuses that are happening.
Thanks so much. Let me follow up with one question actually from the audience, which is very much tackling what we discussed before about the institutional chances, but also like restrictions on accountability mechanisms. Let me read it out. You mentioned, and it goes specifically to you, you mentioned the issue of justice and accountability in Sudan. However, I think this could be far from being resolved, given the fact that one of the reasons, among others, the military generals that made the October 21 coup is fearing precisely this accountability if they'd given power to civilians. Due to the roles played by both al-Burhan and Hemeti, so SAF and RSF leaders respectively, during also the Darfur war back in the 2000s, where they were key instruments of the Bashir government. So how could this resolved when it comes to achieving justice and accountability in Sudan? So precisely their fear of being held accountable if they let go from the current situation.
I think this is also related to the other interest that my fellow panelists have been speaking about. If those countries that have those interests put the interest of the Sudanese people and the victims of this conflict at hand, then we will be able to pass beyond the current hurdle that we see, not just in terms of addressing the conflict, but also on the question of justice and accountability. In many instances, unfortunately, it almost always seems difficult when it comes to questions of justice and accountability, but we have seen it work. Remember, for instance, the violations that happen in Chad. No one ever imagined that Hisne Habre will one day be held to account for the violations that he committed in the 1980s and early 1990s in Chad. But eventually we saw the African Union coming together with the Senegalese government establishing the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Senegal that tried, convicted, and sentenced Hisne Habre. So as our role as civil society, despite the current difficulties that we see and experience in terms of these perpetrators not wanting to give up because they're going to be held account, we see the same in South Sudan. But our role really is to document these violations, to preserve the evidence, and when the factors come together that allow for justice and accountability to be pursued, then we will already have the relevant evidence to hold them to account. We should not tire in pushing the African Union and other actors to really demand justice and accountability, because that is what the perpetrators would want us to do, to see that there is no end to this, and therefore we stop from demanding justice and accountability. We shouldn't, despite the fact that it may seem difficult at the moment.
Dr. Yan, can I add something to that?
Yeah, definitely.
I want to call on Africans in the diaspora. They represent a very important constituency. And that is because if this problem in Sudan is going to be solved, the role of the international community is very important. And Africans who live in the UK, for example, in the European Union countries, in the US, they too, like civil society in the continent, they too are in a position to bring Sudan to the knowledge of people living in these countries. Because here in the US, for example, a lot of people, if I talk to people here in where I live in Utah, most people have no idea what is going on in Sudan. And so it's important for us who live in the diaspora to make sure that we keep this issue on point, so that people who live abroad understand why it is important for them to consider the problem in Sudan as being part of their own problem. Because what happens in Sudan, it's not only important for the rights of girls and women who are being maltreated in Sudan, but also for us as human beings who live in other countries around the world. So the Africans in diaspora have an opportunity to bring the Sudanese problems to their own governments, so that they can understand why it is necessary for these governments to take the problem in Sudan very seriously and find a way to bring this issue to a conclusion, so that the Sudanese people can begin to live a normal life, just like people in other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Perhaps even like in this, we can even open up a bit further. There's a few questions from the audience that I might direct to all of you. One, and this goes a bit into what you spoke about just now, Professor John, about the diaspora and their particular role in making the conflict more known internationally. I have a question from a member of Pax Christi International Sudan Working Group. And this is basically what can civil society organizations and NGOs located outside of Africa do to help bring about peace and justice to Sudan? So where is their opportunities? Where is their particular lever, and what can they bring to the table? Whoever wants to discuss that. May I call Dr. May? Then perhaps you have an idea.
Yeah, sure. I think I've got a little bit of a pessimistic view on this. I mean, the problem is the history of the civil wars that we have in the current world order. So since 1945, I think over the average of the civil war usually lasts 10 years. Syria is no different. Lebanon lasted 15 years. These are at least the closest. And I think that's for a reason. They last so long because they mostly end when one of the parties have victory, a clear victory over others. And usually during that time, all the international institutions try and kind of bring in some attempts to regulate, to control, to stop the war. But in reality, it doesn't really happen. And even when there's settlements and when there are negotiations that are relatively successful, there is always the risk of the war starting again after them. So in a way, the role of the African Union, the UN, of how to stop the war, how to kind of get out of this dark hole becomes more or less like just waiting until there is a party that's more victorious. But unfortunately, the tools of the international law and the tools that many of the international institutions are not effective to actually stop the war. I mean, we talk about accountability, we talk about justice, but that's after the fact. After the war ends, that's where the justice and the peace building and the kind of accountability issues comes into light. But what happens as long as the war goes on? What happens as long as the fighting goes on? It's a big question. Many of the countries, like the UAE, for example, they have broken many of the sanctions, for example, when it comes to Darfur, and they have entered some more like arms and ammunition to areas that the UN have decided that there shouldn't be any arms supply in these areas. And the UN has documented and they provided reports on these issues, but there is no mechanism of sanctioning the UAE or sanctioning other countries and other international and regional actors who are fueling the war, basically. And I think as long as this is happening and as long as there is no incentive to stop this, the international law does not really come into play. Again, I'm very sorry about my pessimism.
Thanks so much. So somebody else who wants to come in on this particular question?
Yes, I'd like to make a comment. Thank you. I still go back to the idea of Africans in the diaspora. Part of the reason has to do with the fact that during the time the military was in government in Nigeria, there were a lot of Nigerians in the US who actually successfully lobbied the US government and multinational companies operating in Nigeria, which had been supporting the military, and it made a big difference in the military leaving government in Nigeria. So I think that Africans in the diaspora can lobby the governments to take an active part in ensuring that the fighting in Sudan can stop. After all, we know that both the Sudanese army and the RSF, they are getting arms from somewhere. Somebody is providing them with the resources, and somebody is helping them purchase the arms. And those arms are coming from independent states, countries. And those countries are subject to sanctions that can be effective, as we can see with what is going on now in Gaza. So I believe that, for example, if the United States really decides that it wants to bring the war in Sudan to an end, it has the capability to do so by putting significant, imposing significant sanctions on the warring parties, by making sure that people who sell arms to them no longer are able to do so. I think that if the US, the European Union, for example, as two important actors, really come down and put their heads together, they can make sure that the fighting in Sudan can stop. I know that it's going to be very difficult to stop the fighting, because the two sides have become so embedded in their own interests, not just as Dr. May said, it's no longer just the two generals who are fighting, but the fact that they are now, the two sides now have interests going all the way down to the local groups that are so invested that they no longer want to stop until there's a final decision. But I think we can hasten that final decision by starving them of the resources that they need to continue to fight. And I believe that that process of starving them can be undertaken with the help of the external groups that are supporting them. And I believe that as stubborn as some of the countries are, like the UAE and Egypt, they can be persuaded by the important Western partners who are providing them with financial assistance and trade and investment. So I think that as to go back to the issue of the Africans in the diaspora taking an opportunity to ensure that their governments realize the humanitarian nature of this problem. This is something that we should be ashamed of, because a recent visit in Sudan showed that a lot of people have been killed. People people who should have grown up to contribute to development, not just in Sudan but in Africa, they are gone. They have been killed, and other people are suffering tremendously. Why should we stand by and continue to see this happen? We need to tell our government, those of us who live abroad, need to tell our government that this situation should not continue to happen, not in this age. And of course, I know 50 years ago, communications were not as good as they are today. We have the internet, we have social media. So I think that our ability to organize and put pressure on our government is better now than it was many years ago, because of the availability of the different communications instruments that we have in our hands today. So I think that a conversation like this one is already the beginning of what I see as an opportunity to make this problem more visible in the West. Why don't we continue and try to get our colleagues to join in and do the same? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Professor John. You've also spoken to another question that is there from the audience, which goes precisely into the support of the warring parties with ammunition and with weaponry that comes from the outside. We know some of the routes are going through the region. We have like planes going into places like Nyala, even with weaponry. We have supports. Dr. May spoke of this before as well, for the south as well. The question here is basically, just to read it out, why hasn't the African Union brought such charges against these regional and international players supporting the parties to the UN or the world courts? I would assume like the ICC. So I would suppose this question goes to international mechanisms of how to prevent the support of weaponry for the warring parties. Whoever wants to come in on that.
Jan, maybe I could take that one. Of course, the fact that numerous countries have been involved in the transfer of weapons against the United Nations Security Council arms embargo into Darfur through other parts of Sudan shows the weakness of the existing arms embargo and its enforcement. I think the biggest challenge is on the question of enforcement of the arms embargo, but also on its expansion to other parts of the country. Why hasn't the AU, send the perpetrators to relevant accountability mechanisms? On the question of weapons in itself, the AU Peace and Security Council several months ago already asked for a study on who are the financiers, who are the funders, who are promoting and fueling this conflict. Unfortunately, months later, that study that was requested has not been done. And in August of this year, just less than 2 months ago, the Peace and Security Council reiterated that they need that study. The problem with the AU is moving from just pronouncement and proposals into action and enforcement, because the AU knows that this is a problem. It has come up with a proposal for an assessment of who are the funders, to what extent and scale, so that they can take action. But even that study hasn't been taken. So I think that there is a need to continue putting pressure on AU and other actors, really want to reinforce and strengthen the enforcement mechanisms for arms embargo, but to publicly call out these actors. Imagine if the AU and other actors actually publicly said that we know that this is what is happening. In the DRC, the public calling of Rwanda as a supporter of the M23 played a role, I think, in bringing those actors into the table, for instance. So I think that could be one of the ways of dealing with this issue.
Thanks so much, Dr. Shafet. With this, we are almost at the end of our discussion. Perhaps may I invite every one of you to very brief closing reflections, perhaps 1 or 2 minutes maximum. Professor John, may I perhaps start with you as a short closing statement?
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Dr. Yan. My feeling here is that, number one, we should, all of us, recognize the suffering of the Sudanese people. We should acknowledge the fact that this senseless war, struggle between which started as a struggle between two individuals for power and wealth, is something that should not be tolerated in Africa or anywhere else in the world, because it's killing people, it's displacing people, it's creating a lot of unnecessary suffering among women and girls in Sudan. And this should not be tolerated by any civilized person or any civilized nation. Of course, the question then is, what should we do in order to make sure that this does not continue to happen in Sudan and that it never happens again? As I said earlier, we need to help the Sudanese people wherever we are, in as much as far as we can, not just by talking, but by making sure that the Sudanese people have an opportunity to reconstruct their society and move on. We need to appeal to the African Union to stop talking and start doing something to help this humanitarian situation in Sudan, and to move forward with making sure that the Sudanese people enjoy the peace that they need to be able to move forward with their lives. The African Union has bragged about African solutions for African problems for many years, but continues to talk and hasn't done very much in terms of what is needed to resolve the problem that we now have on the ground in Sudan. If the Sudanese people are listening, I would appeal to the Sudanese army to return to the barracks and allow the country to move forward. I don't understand how these two individuals want to be remembered in history. I don't understand how they want history to remember them as people who totally destroyed their country, or as leaders who moved their countries forward and provided opportunities for them to develop. So this should be a lesson for other Africans to remember that if you have an opportunity to be in government, to be in the military, your job should be to help your people develop, to help your people live peacefully, and to help your people progress, and not to destroy the country simply because you want power and worth. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Professor John. Dr. May I turn to you for your concluding
Yes,
remarks?
thank you very much. I think my last words is really about what is happening in Sudan should be understood as part of a very long legacy of colonialism, external meddling, rather than the people of Sudan not kind of capable of devising a better mechanism for power transfer. And I think the history of Sudan has been more or less since the independence has been either about coup d'etat or generals fighting or a very long-standing authoritarian regime. And unfortunately, all of this is part of the struggles of consolidating and establishing a state in the post-colonial era. The people are the ones who pay the highest price. And even when they came out in an uprising to remove the dictator, the transition was rather kind of eschewed with the international meddling. And we shouldn't really forget that most of the civilian actors who were participating in the transition government were put aside. Many countries were interested in supporting either the military or the militia during that time, which ended very much in this power struggle that we are seeing now and this devastating civil war. So we shouldn't really forget about the role of these external actors. And I hope one day the Sudanese people will be able to take control of their future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. May. Dr. Chaffet, your closing thoughts.
Thank you. I think my closing calls will really focus on the international community, including the African Union. There is really a dire, disparate need for redoubling of diplomatic actions to address the human rights violations and abuses that have been committed and continue to be committed in Sudan. The Sudan conflict is a tragedy of our time. More than 10.5 million people have been displaced internally. More than 4 million people have sought refuge in neighboring countries as refugees, making Sudan one of the biggest displacement crises in the world in our modern era. Really, this is the time for African Union and the international community to redouble their efforts and address these violations and hold perpetrators to account. Any mechanisms that are established, any mediations that are established to deal with these conflicts, we think there are at least 3 important things that must be at the center of them. One is the protection of civilians, to end violence against civilians. 2 is humanitarian assistance, that aid assistance must reach those who are the people in Sudan. And in this particular moment, those that have been besieged in El Fasher, for instance. And then thirdly is the question of justice and accountability. What we see today in Sudan happening is primarily because perpetrators in the past, beginning from 2003, were never held to account. They have therefore felt emboldened to continue in their ways in committing violations and abuses. So justice and accountability must be at the center of all efforts that are being put in place to address the conflict. Thank you so much, Jan, for this opportunity.
Thanks so much, Dr. Chaffet, and thanks so much from my end for the panel and for this amazing discussion. We hope It was very interesting for the audience as well. And with that, let me hand back to the conversation for closing remarks.
Dr. Jan, thank you so much for a well-moderated panel, such excellent critical insights. It was really fascinating to listen to all the views from the team and from the panel. I'm going to hand over to Adejwan Shoyinka, our regional West Africa editor, to just do an official thank you. Adejwan, over to you.
Thank you, Candice. And yeah, I think my task is very simple. It's just to say thank you and, and then run off. But more importantly, this has been a very, very educative session for me personally. And I believe for many of us who have listened to you and to our panel speak, learned a lot. A number of takeaways that I have, noted in my diary, just listening to our, our erudite panel, and some of them include the fact that, look, like many of our other countries across the continent, the root of the conflict in Sudan is traceable back to the foundation of the country itself and the ethnic composition of the country. Of course, there are several external factors and players responsible for turning the country into a proxy war ground as we speak right now. That there's a need for, an international sort of peace enforcement if you're ever going to get this conflict to come to an end in a manner that would be responsible and that would be good for all parties involved. But of course, who will build that cart? Is it the African Union? Is it the United Nations? Is it the EU? Or is it the US? And we all know the kind of composition of the leadership of some of these places that we've mentioned right now, and the challenges that they themselves have internally. People start thinking of them looking outward to help other people in other continents. And that brings me to the biggest, what I consider to be my biggest takeaway from this session today. It is the fact that, look, only Sudanese themselves can solve the problem of Sudan. And that, so the solution must be homegrown. But I guess the question that could be the topic of another entire conversation really is, and I say this from my perspective also as a Nigerian, and I think we have similar challenge in Nigeria as well. Who really considers themselves to be a Sudanese? I think it's a national question that takes us back to the very first takeaway point of the problem being traceable to the roots of the country and the ethnic composition of the country itself. Do people really see themselves first as Sudanese or first as their ethnic group, before they see themselves as Sudanese? I think that may be a different conversation that we can take up as the conversation. And I hope that if we invite you as experts to be able to oblige us with your time once again. Thank you very much, Dr. Jan Pospisil, for an excellent moderation of this session. And a big thank you to our panelists. In no particular order, I'll start with Dr. May Darwich. Thank you very much for your excellent contribution. Really appreciate that. Dr. Japheth Begon, thank you very much for your time and for your contribution. Professor John Mbaku, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your erudite contribution as well. And a big thank you to members of our audience who've stayed with us from the beginning of this session to now. Even sent in very, very excellent questions that spurred further, responses from our panelists. Thank you very much for being engaging and for participating in the entire session. Also, I must say thank you to my colleagues at the conversation, including those who've held this event together and whose faces you haven't seen on this call, but without whom we probably would not have had a meaningful conversation this evening. Thank you to everyone who's made this a success, and thank you for your time. The conversation continues as you know, we're the Conversation Africa. Conversation continues beyond this session. It would continue on our social platforms. It will continue on our YouTube page, and we may also be seeking to convert some of the conversations here into an article that we can publish on our platform as well. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for your contributions. Appreciate it.
Colleagues, with that, we've reached the end of our dialogue. Thank you for your time and see you next time. Goodbye.